Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. And yesterday there was a big old meeting at the UN with lots of world leaders having their say, including Donald Trump. Trump used his speech not to engage, but to rabble rouse for headlines in America. He was speaking to his base. It's not worth going over the content of his speech because it was not intended to have real world consequences, other, of course, from the fact that it means he does not see America as being a force for geopolitical stability. But I think we'd already got that hint. In this video, I'm going to discuss how the UN is effectively over, something that some world leaders alluded to in their speeches, and even the Secretary General seemed to reference, but how it is possible to find an alternative. But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So the UN was originally set up, like so many institutions after the Second World War, in order to prevent further global wars. Yet look at the situation. It has been powerless to halt the invasion of Russia against Ukraine or Israel against Palestine. It will be similarly powerless to prevent China invading Taiwan or America invading Panama or Greenland. And why is this? Because of the veto. The veto has always prevented the UN acting in certain conflicts, of course. I mean, let's not kid ourselves that the UN was going to be a sort of world morality police or even defender of international laws. It cannot do that. It was able to intervene in many conflicts for the sake of global stability. The entire concept rested on the idea that the major powers were invested in geopolitical stability in order for them to continue being powerful. But things have changed. Russia has been for some years now actively invested in geopolitical instability. Now that Trump has set America on the same course, although in different ways, and China is eyeing up opportunities to gain power where the US is leaving the field, and every major conflict could attract vetoes which prevent action. Most notably, we're already seeing this in Ukraine and Gaza, but even less reported flashpoints such as DRC, Rwanda, Sudan, they don't get robust action from the UN because one of the big three always seems to have some interest in it. So if we're looking at a future where the power of the veto, as Brazil's president was discussing, is going to be used against any action, then the UN ceases to be able to fulfill its primary role. A third world war is not inevitable, but the conditions for it exist and the UN cannot stop it. I mean, think about what the veto has done so far. We've had, I think, 262 vetoes. Each one has slammed the door on civilians who are desperately waiting for help. I mean, think of the names etched in our collective memory. You've got Rwanda, Srebrenica, Aleppo, Bucha, Khan Yunis. Every single one of these places synonymous with suffering, unspeakable suffering. And there's a matching Security Council draft resolution that died, killed by the veto. In Rwanda, the international community stood by as genocide unfolded, unable to act decisively due to political disagreements. Srebrenica, UN declared safe zone. Thousands of men and boys were just massacred after a proposed resolution for stronger intervention was blocked. The Syrian civil war, immense human cost. Russia, sometimes joined by China, repeatedly vetoed resolutions aimed at accountability or even humanitarian access. We're now seeing the same thing with the US veto in similar action in Gaza. The maths is brutally simple and profoundly unfair. If one of the great powers has skin in the game, or perceives its national interest to be at stake, or just so happens to have a madman as a president at the time, the Council's hands are tied. So the very body meant to enforce peace becomes in effect the world's most expensive debating club, paralysed by a structural deadlock that protects the top five's national interests and increasingly the top three, often at the expense of global peace and human rights. This undermines the UN's credibility and its ability to enforce international law. So, I mean, if we look to where we are right now, especially with all those statements and speeches yesterday, and this gridlock is not just a historical footnote, it's our new normal. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has racked up tens of thousands of alleged war crimes, but Moscow simply vetoes any move to hold its troops accountable or condemn its actions. Since the invasion, Russia has used its veto to block resolutions related to the conflict, effectively shielding itself from international condemnation or intervention. In the very next session, Washington torpedoes a Gaza ceasefire text 3 times, even after 14 other members all vote yes, no abstentions vote yes, sparking global outrage and prolonging civilian suffering. The US has often used its veto to protect Israeli interests, particularly concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Same month, different crisis, same infuriating ending, paralysis. Diplomats maybe tried to rationalise the inaction, calling it veto fatigue, but civilians are trapped under rubble, they're facing starvation, they're fleeing violence. It's a death sentence for them. The Council hasn't managed a single binding resolution on either war that actually addresses the core issues, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that when geopolitics gets hot, the fire extinguisher is locked behind the impenetrable wall of great power politics. This structural dysfunction means that despite broad support from non-permanent members for immediate ceasefire resolutions, sometimes even a majority of the permanent members, the Council's ability to act is effectively paralysed. The consequences of a veto depend on what action the resolution was meant to mandate, but they always lead to the UN observing events from the outside. The idea of reforming the Security Council is not new. Every Security General, from the first to the current one, Guterres, has practically begged for veto limits. Every year, the General Assembly holds sessions on council reform, with member states calling for action to ensure that a veto isn't the end of UN action. But every time, the P5 just smile, nod politely and walk away. Why? Because changing the Charter, which is what's required to alter the veto power, needs their consent. It's like asking Turkeys to vote for Christmas. It's just not going to happen willingly. France and Britain, despite our diminished global stature since 1945, cling to our permanent seats and veto power because the prestige, the symbolic weight of being a P5 member, is a lot cheaper to maintain than, say, a fleet of aircraft carriers or a robust global diplomatic network. Russia and the US treat the veto as a crucial extension of their foreign policy, a tool to protect their allies and block actions against their interests. China doesn't use it that much. They tend to keep their powder dry a bit more, but they do wield the threat of it to, stifle debates on sensitive issues like Taiwan. The bottom line is painfully clear. The very people who profit most from the status quo are the only ones who can rewrite it, and a couple of them at the moment don't even want the status quo. And this resistance to reform undermines the UN's credibility and its ability to enforce international law. So is it all lost? No. Humanity is quite ingenious, especially when it's trying to avoid its own messy destruction. After all, look at what we did after the Second World War. So many institutions were set up, including the UN, when the need was undeniable. But we've also found ways around the logjams. In 1950, when the Security Council froze over Korea due to a Soviet boycott, the Uniting for Peace resolution provided a bit of a loophole. The mechanism allowed the UN General Assembly to convene emergency special sessions and recommend collective measures when the Security Council is deadlocked. It's been used quite a few times, nearly a dozen times, most recently for Gaza in 2024 and for Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. There is a catch, of course. Assembly votes are recommendations, they're not binding orders. They politely ask the strong to play nice, but they lack the teeth of a Security Council resolution. Then there's the International Court of Justice. This can rule on state crimes as seen in South Africa's genocide case against Israel. These rulings are legally binding on the parties involved. But here's the problem. The ICJ lacks its own police force to enforce arrest warrants or compel compliance. This is why that South African ICJ case, for example, is stuck in the mud. They're deliberately stringing it out because as soon as they make a judgment that's not enforced, they look weak, right? Enforcement of rulings ultimately falls to the Security Council, where, yes, you guessed it, any of the 5 permanent members can veto efforts at enforcement, and we know that one will. This inherent dilemma means that while the ICJ can issue important judgments, its effective is limited by the very political gridlock it often seeks to circumvent. Regional coalitions sometimes step in to fill these gaps. Kenya led an African Union mission in Somalia, for example. The EU funds sea patrols against Houthi pirates. These initiatives demonstrate how collective action can still happen outside of the UN framework. But these are patchwork quilts, like they're localised, limited in scope. They're not a comprehensive global safety net. They're valuable, but they can't replace an effective global security architecture. So if the current system is basically buggered now, what could replace the veto-choked council? Well, several ideas are already being discussed, offering alternative paths forwards. The first one is the double veto rule. This proposal suggests that 2 vetoes from 2 different P5 members would be needed to block a resolution, preventing a single lone wolf obstruction from grinding progress to a halt. That would make it harder for one nation to unilaterally shut down action, forcing greater consensus among the great powers. The problem with this, to my mind, is that China and Russia are likely to act in unison, so America will strong-arm either France or the UK to back them. Particularly with Trump, we could end up facing severe threats for refusal. Second would be to expand permanent seats. Now, this idea aims to make the Council more representative of today's global power dynamics, not those of 1945. Proposals include adding new permanent members from emerging powers like India, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia perhaps, countries with significant populations, economies and skin in today's crises. That would broaden the base of decision makers, maybe leading to more equitable representation, although of course there is resistance from the current P5 members who do not want to dilute their power. Also, this just adds more vetoes. The first idea at least makes a veto harder. This one makes it more likely. It doesn't actually take any vetoes away, it just adds more into the mix. And reaching consensus on which countries should get new permanent seats remains a major obstacle. Is it going to be based on population, or is it going to be based on, like it was to begin with, military power? Next idea is to flip the hierarchy, which is a much more radical idea. It proposes giving the General Assembly a binding security mandate if 2/3 of its members vote yes, with funding automatically provided by a micro tax on global arms sales. That would bypass the Security Council entirely in certain situations, empowering the broader body of member states to act when the P5 cannot or will not. While the General Assembly already has a role in peace and security, this would significantly enhance its authority and the binding nature of its resolutions. There are, however, of course, multiple problems with this idea. The fact that the veto exists in the first place, remember, is because some may just use military power to oppose a UN resolution. Like, imagine, for example, UN peacekeepers are sent to Ukraine, but Russia just bombs them anyway. Or the same in Gaza and the US attacks them. What would ultimately happen? The UN's power doesn't really derive from international laws, but might makes right. That being said, you could say, would Russia really attack UN peacekeepers if they would shoot back? Putin says so, but maybe the stakes would be too high for him. Similarly with the US in Gaza, let us say a coalition of Arab countries decided to repel the IDF from Gaza. Would the US really attack them? If the force made clear that it wasn't going to invade Israel itself, it was only going to repel them from Palestinian land, would the US really go to war with the entire region for the sake of what? Trump's casinos? So the idea might work, but it's risky. The risk is you actually widen the conflict and make a world war more likely, which the UN was set up to avoid. Indonesia did appeal against this concept of powerful forces doing what they wanted at the UN yesterday by saying might must not make right, right must be right, which sounds brilliant. But right is about morality and is therefore subjective. And the reality of tens of millennia of human history is that actually, for all practical purposes, might does make right. Fourth idea would be to go outside the UN entirely. A new global security forum where coalitions of democracies, middle powers and even selected cities negotiate fast-track humanitarian corridors and coordinate responses themselves. A bit like, think about it as a cross between NATO, which is already like a localised force, meets the Paris Climate Accord. It's opt-in. It doesn't matter that not everyone's part of it. It doesn't even matter if not all the major powers are part of it. It's goal-driven and crucially, it's veto-free. This approach recognises that if the UN remains paralysed, other multilateral platforms will inevitably emerge to fill the void, driven by shared values and common interests rather than historical power dynamics. It's basically saying we've got a problem here. Who wants to help? We want to help. Right. And I guess just sort of hope no one hinders. That remains the most likely in my view. If the UN cannot solve the urgent geopolitical problems, and it can't, then countries will inevitably bypass it. We are already seeing signs of it now. I got the impression the meeting of the UN yesterday, there were a lot of really impassioned appeals. It's a last-ditched appeal to make the current system work. Many countries are not going to feel that it's feasible to stand by while powerful idiots watch the world burn. Now let's imagine, 10 years in time, 2035, what would a world really look like if the Security Council didn't exist? right? The UN would still exist because it still sends aid, it feeds refugees, it runs vital vaccine programs. Its humanitarian development work is separate from the Security Council, therefore it's separate from the current gridlock. There's no reason why that couldn't continue. But when wars flare up, leaders wouldn't fly to New York, they may fly to Mumbai or Brasilia, right? Where club membership depends on troop contributions and economic influence. Literally, who wants to help? What have you got to help with? Right, let's band together and help. Doesn't depend on who had nukes in 1945. Sanctions would pass within 48 hours because no single capital could kill them with a raised hand. War criminals could actually land in The Hague a bit faster because arrest warrants would be served by whoever signs up. No vetoes, no excuses. Now, if this sounds a little optimistic, maybe. But it is already half happening. The International Criminal Court, that relies on the cooperation of its 123 willing member states, unlike the ICJ. That proves that global justice can function without universal consent or a P5 blessing. The G20 coordinates global economies without a veto system. COP summits set climate rules by majority consensus. COP this year, for example, we know the US isn't going to take part in it. Nonetheless, it's going to come up with some resolutions. It's going to come up with action. Doesn't matter that the US doesn't want part of it. Governance without the P5 stranglehold isn't fiction. It can happen. It is already emerging in various forms because the world cannot afford to wait for the Security Council to act. This fragmentation of UN efforts is a direct result of the Security Council's inability to act decisively. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.